So, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Daniel Thornton. I'm a Programme Director here at the Institute. The Institute for Government, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is a charity that works to make government or help make government more effective. And that's very much what we'll be talking about today. You'll see on this board that there is a Twitter tag. Please do tweet what you're hearing and seeing. I'll assume if you're looking at your phone, you are in fact tweeting and not checking your email. I've recently returned to the UK, and while I was overseas, I was in the habit as a former civil servant of giving health and safety announcements at the beginning of meetings. And nobody does it except us, so everybody thinks you're completely crazy. But now I'm going to give you a health and safety briefing because we're in the UK. So there are no planned fire alarm tests today. So if the fire alarm does sound, follow the instructions given by the fire wardens and leave the building quickly and safely via the nearest safe exit, which in this instance is down the main stairs and out the front door. So the way you came in, I assume. That should be familiar to you. Proceed to the point by the George VI statue. He's the former monarch behind the Queen Mum, to the right of the building. Identify yourself to the fire warden there and await further instructions. Do not, in capitals, stop to collect personal belongings, use the lifts, or re-enter the building until the all clear has been given. I hope everybody's clear about all that. So, to the business of the day. The government puts out lots of data, but sometimes it's hard to understand. And while things have got better, it's sometimes hard to find and to make sense of. Now, Gavin here, I'll introduce him shortly, and his team have found the data and made it easy to understand. And they're going to tell you some of the stories that can be found in the document we're publishing today, the Whitehall Monitor 2015. Here we go. You have an executive summary on your chair. I'll now introduce the panel you see before you. On my right is Jeni Tennison, the Technical Director and Deputy CEO of the Open Data Institute. Jeni has played key roles in developing legislation.gov.uk and data.gov.uk. She's a member of the Open Standards Board, and she was awarded an OBE for services to technology and open data in 2014. Over on the right, Megan Lucero is the data journalism editor at the Times and Sunday Times. She's one of the first data journalists employed by these two titles and led the data team's development from a small unit to a key component of Times investigations. And people who've read the Times will know how seriously they take data and presentation of it. And Megan led the data analysis of issues such as voter preferences in the approach to and during the UK's last general election. And then on my left here, Gavin Freegard, who joined the Institute in 2013, and he's ably led the creation of the Whitehall Monitor. He was previously an advisor to Harriet Harman MP, and before that, Deputy Director of the Orwell Prize and Senior Researcher at the Media Standards Trust. So the format for today will be that Gavin will introduce the report. The panel will make some remarks for 5 or so minutes. I'll be ruthless with timekeeping in order that we can have lots of time for discussion. We will finish by 10 a.m. promptly. So, without further ado, over to Gavin.
Thank you, Daniel, and good morning, everyone. And welcome to the launch of Whitehall Monitor 2015, the coalition in 163 charts. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to run through all of them this morning. We're going to show you 16 from the report. That's a reduction of 90%, the sort of settlement that George Osborne can only dream of at the moment. The first bit of that title, though, works, the coalition. We're going to look at what happened over the last 5 years to try to help us see what might happen over the next 5. We're going to tell 4 main stories this morning. The first is on spending. It's the spending review next week, as I'm sure many of you are aware. We'll look at what's happened to finances over the last 5 years, what that might mean for the next 5. That also has consequences for the civil service workforce. We'll be looking at how the size of the civil service has changed and what that might mean after the spending review. Digital was one of the watchwords of the last Parliament. Again, we'll see a little bit about what happened then and what might come next. And finally, as you might expect from a data-driven project, we're going to talk a little bit about data, particularly important in light of the Prime Minister's comments about wanting a smarter state and how data might help with that. So to begin with spending, the coalition came to power looking to reduce the deficit. That's the difference between government's revenue and government's expenditure. How well did they do? If you look at this chart, you can see the blue markers are the receipts, so the revenue that government has got. And in 2009-10, it was just over 530 billion. That climbed to about 650 billion at the end of the coalition. So that's the money that government brought in. In terms of what government spent, you can see it was actually higher in each year, again rising from about 690 billion before the coalition to 740 billion at the end of it. Now what does that mean for the deficit, which is the difference between those two numbers? It has actually narrowed, as the coalition intended, from about 154 billion to 90 billion. Now George Osborne wants to see that deficit of 90 billion converted into a surplus at some point during the course of this Parliament. How has the coalition achieved that? Well, part of the story has been about quite tight controls on public spending, something that receives a lot of attention. But there are other parts of government finances which don't necessarily receive the same attention. For instance, assets and liabilities. Now, you can see the scale on this chart. We're talking in billions. If we look at assets and liabilities, we're talking in the trillions. They're much larger numbers, as you might expect. The purple markers are the assets that government has, the resources that it might expect to make money from. And that's risen from 1.25 trillion before the coalition to 1.4 towards the end. But you can see those liabilities at the top, those grey markers, have risen by quite a good deal more, from about 2.5 to 3.2 trillion. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about government liabilities? We mean things like the public debt, like public sector pensions. But we've also seen rises in the liabilities held by certain departments. For instance, clinical negligence at the Department of Health and nuclear decommissioning at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. They've risen during the course of the Parliament, and overall you've seen the net liability has risen overall. Spending review next week, we might see George Osborne starting to pay a bit more attention to some of those assets and how, with further spending reductions expected, the government might seek to make some more money out of them. Of course, it needs to be sustainable rather than just a short-term measure to increase value. So that's a very top-level view of government finances. We've got 12 beautiful pages in the annual report if you want to take a look in more detail later. But I do want to pick out a few more stories that look at the departmental level of government spending. This is total managed expenditure by different departments. Now, as you can see, I've hidden the department names. We'll come on to that in a second. I think when people tend to think about Whitehall departments, they often think about what's similar. They think that each of them has a Secretary of State, has a certain number of civil servants and a certain amount of money to spend. But as you can see from this chart, they're actually very different organisations, running from some which have huge budgets of 175 billion, all the way around the spiral to departments with around 200 million. Now this is where I ask the audience, that big 175 billion department, what do you think the biggest spender in government is? Which department? DWP. Number 2, 120 billion? Health. Very good. And the smallest, 200 million, any guesses? Treasury. Excellent. So you can see that between them, DWP and the Department of Health are responsible for around 50% of all departmental spending. The Treasury is the smallest. Nonetheless, it is the sun at the centre of the Whitehall planetary network around which everything else orbits. So departments differ in how much money they have to spend. They also differ in how they spend it. And what we've tried to do is group departments around 4 particular ways in which they do that. This is a heat map. The darker the pink, the more of a department's resources are channeled through a particular method. Now we start with these departments which directly manage a lot of their resources. Ministry of Defence, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions. They tend to have lots of frontline services, if you think about DWP and job centres, and a lot of those things are under direct control, in theory at least, from the Permanent Secretary and from the Minister. Now, thinking about the spending review, if you want to try to take money out of some of those departments and reduce spending, the sort of things you might be thinking about are further staff reductions. We've seen quite a few of those already, and we'll see some charts on that later. And also digitising public services. So that's our first group of direct management departments. We then move on to those that channel a lot of their resources through ALBs, through arm's length bodies, sometimes known as quangos. Some examples there are the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which has all the museums and galleries, and also BIS, Business, Innovation and Skills. It's already been in the news over the last few weeks ahead of the spending review that there may be some changes to research councils, which are arm's length bodies of BIS. Now again, taking money out of these departments, governments are attracted like moths to the flames of the bonfire of the quangos. They tend to try to reduce numbers, but it should be about much more than a numbers game. You need much more sensible reform of arm's length bodies and consider what functions they should be performing and whether it's rightly done at arm's length or within the department. Our third group are the system and grant funders: Home Office, the Department for International Development, Communities and Local Government, and Education. These are, as the name suggests, departments which give out grants or fund particular systems. In the case of communities and local government, that's local councils. In the case of education, again, that's also giving money to local authorities to run schools. And again, there's been a little bit of news around the Home Office and the police grant in recent weeks and how that's calculated. Our final group of departments, I say group, there are only a couple of them where this is particularly noticeable, around markets and contracting, so actually getting other providers to run bits of your public services. Ministry of Justice, that tends to be probation as well as legal aid. Again, education, sort of academies, we would tend to class under that. Again, the Prime Minister has talked quite a lot about wanting to bring more providers into the public service market landscape, and running these public service markets requires departments to have the skills to do that. So you can see our full heat map. It's quite useful, I think, for departments to know what other departments run their business in a similar way, so they can try to learn from them. It's also worth bearing in mind that some of those models have shifted quite considerably during the last Parliament. One example is the Department for Education, with more schools becoming academies. Now, there's a sort of cautionary tale here as well. The Comptroller and Auditor General, the head of the National Audit Office, offered an adverse opinion on the Academy section of DfE's accounts because it was very difficult to work out what was actually going on with the finances. And again, it's a warning that the consequences of changing model, you need to make sure that your department is set up to run things in a very different way. So, departments vary in the amount of money they have to spend and how they spend it. They've also varied in how that's changed since 2010, and we tried to put some numbers on that in the report. It's actually very difficult. Baselines change. Numbers are different in different financial releases across government. Occasionally, different bits of money transfer between departments. For instance, the police grant has moved from communities and local government to the Home Office. So we tried to conduct a particular transparency exercise. Departmental spending plans inevitably change during the Parliament. So the question we asked was, could we explain why? Could we find explanations from the departments themselves as to why numbers were changing between different budgets and different spending reviews? The short answer was, in too many cases, no, we couldn't. This is our Transparency League table. If you look at the top, departments like Culture, Media and Sport, Energy and Climate Change and Health either had very small changes or were quite good at explaining them. They put documents on their website and gave documents to select committees to explain what had actually changed. Right down at the bottom, you see the Chancellor's departments, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs and Her Majesty's Treasury, which, as we've seen earlier, is responsible for everybody else's budgets. One of the reasons that they rank so low is that in some documents you can't actually work out the split between the Treasury and HMRC. Especially if there are to be further spending reductions coming ahead, it's really important that more of this is published and that we are able to follow what's actually happening with government finances. So that's spending. Moving on to workforce. Now, the public sector workforce overall is about 4.4 million. We're going to look at just under 10% of that, which is the civil service, those public servants working most directly for government. And you can see that the number has fallen over the last 5 years. If you look at that pink line, at the time of the spending review in 2010, there were around 480,000 civil servants, full-time equivalent. At the end of the coalition in March 2015, that number was more like 405,000, a reduction of 15%. And as you can see from that pink line, quite a substantial reduction. However, it's not as deep as the government expected it to be. That dotted white line is where the government thought the size of the civil service would be at the end of this year, 380,000. That dotted black line shows you a projection from the spending review in 2010 if they wanted to meet that. And you can see that reductions were sort of on track until 2014 and then sort of veer off. I think that highlights how difficult it may be after the next spending review to reduce the civil service any further. And you can also see the pattern, the sort of front loading of cuts before it becomes more difficult towards the end. Now it's 15% overall, but it's very different for different departments. Up in the top left-hand corner, we have 3 departments: Energy and Climate Change, Department for International Development, and the Cabinet Office, which have actually had growth in headcount. In the bottom right, we've got DWP and DCLG. They had reductions of between 30 and 35%, so much more substantial. And you can see in our annual report all of the different departments. Again, it shows that departments had a different experience over the last 5 years, but also they're going to be starting from very different baselines after the next spending review. Those reductions also have consequences for the composition of the civil service. As the NAO has pointed out, quite a lot of these reductions are made through recruitment freezes and new people not being brought in. That means the civil service has become much older over the last 5 years. If we look at the percentage of the civil service that were aged under 30, it goes from 14% in 2010 to just 9% in 2015. And as we move from under 30 to over 30, regrettably something that we all have to do at some point, we can see that remains reasonably stable. 40 to 49 age group, there's actually a 4 percentage point decrease because a lot of those are flowing into the most noticeable story on this chart, which is the growth in the civil service aged 50 to 59, going from a quarter to a third of the civil service over the last 5 years. When you add in the over 60s, you can see 40% of the civil service are aged over 50. Now again, that has consequences for people not coming in at more junior levels, perhaps bringing new skills and perspectives. The civil service has become older. It's also become more concentrated at more senior grades. This is one of our spaceship charts. Let me explain it to you. This shows the civil service in 2010, and we move from the most junior civil service grades at the bottom to the most senior at the top. We've mirrored the chart to give it that distinctive shape to make it a bit easier to read. Around 45% of the civil service were at the most junior grades in 2010, and you can see as you move up through each grade, the percentage gets slightly smaller. That's 2010. Let's see what happens between 2010 and 2015. You can see there's a shift from the bottom grades to sort of higher up the civil service. And in fact, if I then put in the next slide, you can see the light blue is the change, the sort of increase from 2010 to 2015, and the grey is what was there in 2010 but no longer is. You can see that it's become more senior. But that's the whole civil service. If we look at every single department, you see a vast array of different shapes. Up in the top left-hand corner, we have the sort of kite and diamond-shaped DFID, lots of people at senior level, and again, that's increased since 2010. DEC and the worryingly coffin-shaped Cabinet Office. Down at the bottom line, we have sort of exotic temple-shaped departments, including the Dome of St. Paul's, that is the Department for Work and Pensions, right at the end. Now, those shapes very much reflect what those departments do. The ones at the top left tend to be sort of dominated by civil servants around the minister. The ones at the bottom tend to be much more involved in frontline delivery. Obviously, DWP, MOJ, particularly good examples of that. Again, what's going to happen to these shapes over the next 5 years? Lynn Homer, the Permanent Secretary of HMRC, gave an interview a few months ago where she said she thought HMRC might become more diamond-shaped as more and more frontline services were digitised. It remains to be seen whether that happens, but it's something for us to look out for over the next 5 years. So lots of change. Staff reductions, changes to what departments do, budget reductions. How do civil servants actually feel about that? What is the morale within the service like? Quite an important indicator of the health of an organisation. Well, as this incredibly exciting chart shows you, it's actually remained reasonably steady. This is the engagement index, which measures how civil servants feel about their department, whether they'd recommend it as a good place to work to others. That's the overall picture. It obviously masks great variation within departments themselves. You can see DCLG, which, as we saw, took quite a hit on staff reductions, finds itself in a bit of a pickle, as it were. Thank you very much. By 2011, sort of reduction in engagement, and then it recovers by the end of the Parliament. You see a similar story at DWP, and DFE saw its engagement fall every single year to 2013 before recovering in the final 2 years. Now, some people at the time of the 2014 survey remarked that that coincided with particular Secretaries of State moving on. To be very clear, it's actually more likely to be driven by reduction rounds that have finished and the departments coming through. Again, if we are to see further staff reductions over the next 5 years, you may have to see civil service and political leaders managing through that sort of change and those sort of engagement challenges. So moving on to the third story, digital, one of the big words of the last Parliament. On a simplistic level, it's just about putting things online, but actually it can mean much more fundamental transformation in how public services are delivered and how the citizen interacts with the state. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with gov.uk, the single central government website, which came on stream in October 2012. Those are the weekly visitors to gov.uk, and you can see they've increased from 4 million to 12 million a week. Those big dips are people deciding not to go on over Christmas. But digital is about much more than just information provision and finding out information about departments. It's also about public services. And the Government Digital Service, GDS, chose 25 exemplars to demonstrate what might be possible. I'm going to run through 3 of those very quickly. The first is voter registration. Now, just to explain this chart very quickly, you've got the months going across the top, and the circles mark particular milestones in the project. Discovery being completed is user testing finishing. Public beta is when it's still in testing but partly public, and live is when it goes live. So voter registration, how many of you registered to vote online? Anybody want to put their hands up? Quite a lot of you. Excellent. And it's been seen as a success. User satisfaction was very high and lots of people used it. It was very much a front-end transformation. It sort of put a new digital bit, even though things were then sent to your local authority, who then sent you your ballot papers. But it does show what can be possible. That's front-end transformation. Over the next 5 years, we might see more fundamental transformation of the entire process, which is where we move on to prison visit booking. Now, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up if you've used this one. Again, you can see it went live during the last Parliament. Prison visit booking is a good example of what GDS called government as a platform. The idea that there are certain things that happen in many places across government, like a meeting booking system, which you could build a single platform for. It's something that GDS has been very keen on. Again, it remains to be seen after the spending review what happens to it. Because for all of the successes of digital transformation, there have been a few that have been less successful. Rural payments, you can see, did not end up going live. It turned out to be complex, unusable, and people had to revert to paper forms. So it does show that there are real challenges around digitising services for all of the potential. We've only seen the beginning of that potential over the last 5 years. With GDS having lost a lot of its senior leadership and with the spending review next week, it remains to be seen what will happen to digital government over the next 5 years. Again, the Institute will be doing a project on that over the next few months. Finally, we come to the last story, data. We've started thinking about data in 3 ways at the Institute, and the first of those is data as data, the raw material from which everything else flows. The UK has a very good record on that, and we've come a very long way over the last 5 years. In fact, some of the civil servants responsible for that are in this room and deserve a great deal of credit for it. The fact that we can produce a report of 170 pages about government data is testament to that progress. So too is the UK's world-leading position. These are 2 international rankings. Font seems to have been screwed up a little bit, do excuse me. You can see the Open Data Barometer on the left, the Open Knowledge rankings on the right, 2013 to 2014. The UK was top ranked in both surveys in both years. Again, lots to be proud of. But we shouldn't be complacent. There's still too much data which is published in PDFs, a format which is much more difficult for us to use. There's a lot of data which isn't published at all. The performance of private providers of public services, for example. And there's some questions around data quality in some instances as well. I'm just going to show you one example of that. This is showing you the professions of civil servants in different departments. The boxes run from 2010 to 2015. Pink is delivery, blue is policy, the lighter shades of grey are various others, and that really dark bit of grey you can see on HMRC, that's where it's listed as unknown, other, or not reported. So those departments, you get a pretty good idea of what's happened. Not so much with these departments. As I said, the dark grey is where we don't know what the profession of civil servants are. DFT, that's actually 100% in 2015. And across the civil service, we don't know the profession of 1 in 8 civil servants. Now, that should be fairly basic management information. It's particularly important if you're looking at making more reductions to your staffing over the next 5 years, and if, as we saw with DFE earlier, you're changing fundamentally what the department does. You need to know what your civil servants can do. So that's data as data. The next thing is data as information. Sort of taking some of that data and turning it into something meaningful, making sure that important stories aren't hidden in plain sight. Now, hopefully that's something that we do through Whitehall Monitor, but it's also something that government should be doing better in some instances. Again, to take one example, in fact, as all the professions, you can see them in the report. To take one example, impact indicators. Now, these were data sets that were supposed to map onto what the policies and reforms of departments were over the last 5 years. Things like number of trains running on time, the number of people on particular types of benefit, reoffending rates. And we conducted quite a large transparency exercise to see, could we find all of this data, and was it explained in a way that would make it meaningful to the public? Have a look for the presentation column on this table. You can see in many cases it wasn't. Now, sometimes that was because the information was so far out of date, but on many other occasions it was because departments didn't even say what direction they wanted the impact indicators to head in. Now, that's data as information, but the fact that a lot of the data wasn't published at all, we had dead links to the treasuries, for instance, that it wasn't updated regularly, and that it wasn't published in an open format, implied that the data simply wasn't being used by the centre of government, by departments themselves, by Parliament to scrutinise government, or by the public. And that brings me on to the final point, data as evidence, actually using the data for something, whether that is to scrutinise government or to look at its operations and improve how it works. Now, there's been a lot of discussion over the last few weeks about using data, which has been very welcome. And there's been a particular word doing the rounds, which some of you may or may not have encountered. So I thought it would be fun to search for this particular word around the use of data on gov.uk. And you can see it's been mentioned twice, once in 1977 and once a few weeks ago. Anybody know what that word might be? Any guesses? It's dog fooding. Hands up if you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. Excellent. So we can dispense with the 1977 use of it. I mean, who knew that gov.uk had such a distinguished history? The 1977 mention is actually a fascinating report on the supply of dog food and cat food to the UK. We don't need to worry about that one. But the more recent mention was Matt Hancock, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, at the Open Data Institute Summit on the 3rd of November. And he talked about dog fooding there. Dog fooding is based on the principle that you consume whatever you produce. And it goes back to the chief exec of a pet food company who, yes, did actually consume his pet food. The idea is that the civil service, government, all of us should be doing much more to actually use the data that we produce. It will make it higher quality if people are using it. It's the same principle as making data open. If people are using it, you will find mistakes, it will drive up the quality. But it's also essentially about using data to understand government better and to improve its operation. So to summarise those 4 stories very quickly, on spending, we've seen the government reduce the deficit over the last 5 years. Departments have changed how they spend some of their money, but we do need to know a lot more about government finances. On workforce, we've seen the civil service has become smaller, it's become older, it's become more senior, and there are challenges ahead if we're to see any further reductions, especially around engagement. Digital, there's huge potential there, but we need to see what happens at the spending review. And data, the UK has been seen as a world leader. We can get better at producing data as data, the raw material. We can get better at presenting it in a meaningful way, and we can all become better at using it to make government more effective. One final slide, which is also on the use of data. We hope that you'll use Whitehall Monitor to help you understand government better and again to drive improvements. The annual report today, there will be some copies available afterwards, is one mechanism to do that. We also publish blog posts throughout the year, and we'd really like people to sort of tell us how it's going, which is why we'll also be making available an online survey. Help us to help you use government data, make government data better, and ultimately to make government more effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Treasury and Cabinet Office officials in the room, you'll shortly have the opportunity to set the record straight and defend the honour of your departments at the bottom of the various league tables. But let's first hear from Jeni Tennison. Over to you.
So I'm going to reiterate quite a lot of, I think, what Gavin has been talking about the use of data. To me, then, data is only ever relevant or important if it helps to alter the decisions that we make. It doesn't have to be that data completely determines what decisions that we make, but we should be making decisions that are informed by data that we have. When we drive a car, then we use data from the sensors that are on the car to help inform us about how fast we're going, how much fuel there is left in the tank. We have a GPS router for us to help us tell us where we should be going. If we don't use those pieces of information, then we are reliant on, just looking out the window in order to have a guesstimate about how fast we're going, or breaking down in the middle of the countryside when our fuel runs out. So when we drive a car, we use the data that is available to us in order to help make decisions about where to turn, about how to slow down, and about when we need to refuel. Government needs to similarly be using data in order to make decisions when it needs to make decisions about the shape and funding of government as a whole. And that's particularly true for Cabinet Office and Treasury, who are making those kinds of decisions. They need to have data available to them about the costs of the whole of the public sector, about the staff, about the physical assets. They need to have data about revenue, around taxation and sales. And we've seen that data is available and it can be used. To me, the thing that was really apparent when looking through the Whitehall Monitor report is the relative lack, though, of data about performance, about how well we're doing government is doing in the things that it sets itself as goals. Now, I know from being at a senior level within the Open Data Institute that it's really hard to set your goals. It's really hard to decide what it is that you should be focusing on. It's really hard to decide what are the things that are the most important and therefore where you put the most effort. It's really hard to decide how to measure those things as well. But having key performance indicators, having metrics that help to reflect back to you how well you are doing on the goals that you have set yourself is extremely important in working out how to prioritize your spending, how to prioritize where you make cuts, how to stop doing activities that are not proving effective to the overall goals that you have. Data can't help you determine what those goals should be, but it can help you determine whether you are meeting those goals and how effectively you are spending your money. So to me, then that's a big gap around what data we are able to get hold of from government about how well it's performing. And without that, then I think it's very difficult for government to make informed decisions about where it cuts, where it focuses its effort. So that was my first point, that data needs to be used in order to make decisions. And of course, in order to use data to make decisions, then you need to have access to that data. One of the ways in which we are talking at the Open Data Institute about the data that you need in order to make decisions is framing this as your data infrastructure. And that's a common understanding now within Cabinet Office and elsewhere, that we need to have a data infrastructure at a national level to aid the digital economy, that we need to have data infrastructure at a local level in order to have smart cities. But I think what this kind of report shows is that government also needs to think about its internal data infrastructure in order for it to make better decisions. So what are the list of things that government needs to know about itself in order to make informed decisions? One example of a piece of data infrastructure that is highlighted by the report and elsewhere as lacking is simply a list of the bodies that make up the public sector. Right? A standard list of those. Now, it's not in fact that that list doesn't exist. In fact, there are several lists of bodies that make up the public sector, which are all different in all different places. What there isn't is one list that you can use, that you can refer to consistently across the data that is made available about spend, about revenue, and about performance. And the reason that that list doesn't exist is because it's actually pretty hard. It's not just about, it's about deciding what do we mean by public sector? What do we mean by public sector body? When are two different different bodies different from each other? It's also about setting up the governance, the funding, the policies, the standards around what that list actually contains and deciding who is going to maintain it. So there can be the list that is used by Treasury for deciding where it needs, which organisations need to receive money. There can be the list that is maintained by Gov UK for deciding which departments and public sector bodies need to be listed on the website. Those are different lists, but when we need to have a single list, we need to decide who is going to manage it, who is going to maintain it, how are they going to decide on changes to it, who gets to have a say. So it's not just identifying what data government needs, it's also putting the framework and structure, the data infrastructure around that. The second point around being able to access and get hold of this information was something that Gavin highlighted, was that we also need, in order to get a full picture of what the public sector is doing, to get data from the private sector and from the third sector, which is actually delivering services. And that ensuring that we're getting data from those other bodies, not just from the public sector itself, means that we get a better picture about what the whole of the public sector is delivering. That means writing into contracts that those bodies, those other groups and organisations need to be giving data back to government, and preferably publishing that as open data so that there's accountability for what they are doing and so that others can use it to inform their own actions. Publishing open data from organisations that are delivering on behalf of the public sector also helps to ensure that there's better competition when it comes to reletting contracts, because other organisations who want to bid for those contracts can see what the previous organisation did and what data they relied on in order to do it. And this brings me on to my third point about access to data. Having this data as open data enables a whole range of activities that you wouldn't have if government just kept it all to itself. When I was thinking about what I wanted to say around this, the three things that came to mind were that as a large organisation, government it's very hard for there to be a single point of view on everything that is going on. Having open data being published by individual organisations means that that data can be brought together, and it means that you can get benchmarking across the whole of the public sector, the kind of comparisons that Gavin was going through. The second thing is that it enables research, so we can answer questions like, or hope to answer questions like, whether a small government means that you get more innovation. And having open data means that third parties can create tools and sell back into government analysis of the data that they have been published. So I was heartened to see one mention in the report about how IFG's nice little pictures about the workforce and distribution of the workforce are being taken up by departments as being useful indicators for them. So those are the three things that I thought of, and then as I was walking along I realised that I hadn't even put into that list democratic accountability, right? Simply having transparency about what government is doing is important for accountability purposes. Third thing that I wanted to talk around data was about quality. And Gavin's already mentioned how difficult it is to get hold of data when it is stuffed inside PDFs. He's talked about how sometimes data is out of date and that timeliness of data is really important, having regular publication, not just publishing when you're hit around the head with a baseball bat by Cabinet Office because they say that they want to have some data out, but continuing to do that regularly on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis. Another point that came out in the report was around the inconsistencies in data. And you can have inconsistencies internally within a data set where simple values are not entered in the same way, which you can just kind of clean up if you want to. But the more pernicious kinds of inconsistencies are where the data that's collected, it varies between publishers. So they use different definitions of a particular term when they're collecting data about something, or varies over time, because that means that you can't do proper comparisons over time, and all those nice graphs that show changes over time may or may not reflect reality when the definitions of what you're collecting is changing. All of these different quality issues impact on the cost of actually using the data. So the amount of work that has gone in from Institute for Government to pull this all together, I can only guess at, and I'm sure Gavin can attest with his bags under his eyes, etc., etc. That's all right. But this is true across. If we want organisations to be benchmarking against this data, if we want them to be performing research on this data, if we want them to be giving back tools, if every single organisation has to go through that same amount of effort in order to pull together this data, it's a huge waste when it could be published in a much cleaner, more consistent fashion from the start. So the final kind of area that I was going to talk about is what is government doing now? And I don't live inside government, so I can't say exactly what government is doing now, but I'll talk a little bit about what it is from what I know. I've sat in several events here where Francis Maud has spoken about how when a new government comes in, then it's very, very keen on transparency and accountability because it's a new government and it wants to show up the old government. And how they were determined he was determined that wasn't going to be the case. Of course, Francis Maud has moved on from Cabinet Office now, and we have Matt Hancock in place there. From what he has been talking about around dog fooding, around the use of data within government, I think he has demonstrated some commitment to that. But we have to wait and see whether this new government has a similar commitment to transparency and accountability as the previous one. What there is within government, and you may have seen this announced fairly recently, is a new data programme which is looking at 3 general areas. So it's looking at capability, particularly around data science capability for policymakers so that they can use their own data. It's looking at infrastructure, and particularly the technical infrastructure that needs to be built so that data is better managed within government. And it's looking at policies around data as well. What I would highlight is that the kind of data that we're looking at here about the way in which government functions is really quite a small fraction of the kind of data that government has to deal with and of the kind of questions that government has to answer, the kinds of decisions that government has to make on a day-to-day basis. So if we look and imagine the amount of work that goes into pulling this kind of data together and then amplify it to all of the other kinds of activities and all of the other kinds of decisions that government needs to make, we can see that using data effectively in government is a massive job. It's one that we're really at the very early stages at. And I would say this is not just true of government, it's true of the private sector as well. It's true across the board that we're at a very early stage of learning how to use data effectively within organisations. So we just have to keep going. We have to not rest on our laurels and think that this is good enough. We have to keep improving what we are doing. just in order to stay still in some ways. So to just wrap up, I think the Whitehall Monitor shows real potential for what you can get when you pull data like this together. But what needs to happen is that this data doesn't just end up in pretty graphs that you can say, yes, that looks pretty and we can see these changes, but is then used in order to drive decision making. Those of you in the room that are making decisions, pay attention to it, think about it, and try to also feed back about what extra information would help you to make better decisions, and what extra and additional ways of presenting that information would help you to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeni. Thank you, Jeni. Some very important messages there. Let's hand over to Megan.
Thank you. I think it's massively important that Jeni just mentioned accountability and transparency, because that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. So we've heard a lot from the Whitehall Monitor about the importance of data. We've heard a lot about the importance of cleaning it, of looking at, of measuring, and being able to act on it. And so I'm just going to give you a few examples of how we can be doing that, and how the Times is doing that at the moment with institutions across the board, and how important I believe that is, especially with FOI under threat, and especially with data in general. We talk about the struggle of data right now, and it's basically my job to untangle that and try to make sense of it, and try to hold some people accountable to that. First thing I would just start with is that what we're doing is nothing new. I'm sure all of you know this, and this goes across the board. Everything I'm saying basically about what we're doing right now in journalism could be said right now, I'm sure, with government. That data journalism is nothing new, and government using data is nothing new, the public service using data is nothing new. I love this chart because on the left-hand side, 1895, that's the Times' reporting of the election, and this is 2015 from the Telegraph. So you've got very little in terms of how we change with election mapping, but also just very little difference in terms of saying, taking information and how do we make sense of it for people. That really hasn't changed over time. But what the Times is trying to do at the moment is invent that concept, reinvent the idea that data and using data is nothing new. So we've brought in a team of computational journalists. So I have a statistician on staff, programmers. It's completely new for the Times. It's completely terrifying to most of the journalists. We've got this little team, this American running around, and basically what we're doing is trying to shake up what journalism is doing to hold government institutions accountable by just being able to process information, and that's been massively important. And what we essentially are doing is investigating data in a way that a human could never do without a computer before. When we're talking about digital, we're talking about putting this information out there. It's not just to appease people by having a form to enter information in, although that's massively important for people to have voter registration and, like I said, sort of calendar meetings. But it's important, as we've mentioned, for transparency. But we're moving into a space where everything is digitized. Everything that you do is being put online, and so someone's got to go through that, and that's our job now to do that. And I would argue that every organization and institution needs to be thinking about that. So the first thing I mentioned is that we use programming for story finding. This is a chart that we did during the election. As mentioned, I ran a team looking into the election, and what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is where people voted in 2010 and where people say they were going to vote. This was a story showing that nearly half of the population was looking to vote for another party. This used modeling. We had several models going in the back of this. We were looking at various factors of what's kind of going through. It allowed us to understand like where this UKIP group was coming from, and where this Lib Dem flocking was going. I think prior to this moment, we knew that student changes from Lib Dems and a lot of things were making people leave the party, but we were able to actually see it in the data and see it going through, and allowing this to inform, like I said, our readers and inform the public. But this was the extent to which we were able to use polling data. I'm very fortunate to have hired some very brilliant people from my team during the election. We used polling data for part of these models because we were able to do it for top level. So this came out November last year, ahead of the election. So, but we got to a point when we looked at the polling data and we realized there was no way we could use it. It was flawed, the margins were skewed, the samples were too small. They were marrying large levels down to constituencies they didn't have enough data for. And I had to make the very difficult decision to say, we're not going to use polling data in the lead up to the election. My bosses were not very happy with me. The Guardian's doing it, the Telegraph's doing it, everyone else is doing it. Why are you so special that you don't want to use this data? And I'm very glad that we didn't in the end. But it meant that it was very, very difficult. We had to reinvent and rethink of new ways of tackling it. And this is one of the problems we talk about now when you don't have clean data, you don't have reliable data, and also talking about consuming what you produce, everyone was happy to use that, and they continued to do it. So on the night, we ended up actually running a model that took some very, very basic data, looking basically at constituencies, just looking at constituency level data, demographic data about people, how many big businesses, education levels, housing, whatever it is. And the one you're seeing on the left-hand side was the main one. As we fed in the results, we fed it into this, it's called a classification tree. It's a machine learning algorithm. And essentially you're coming through and you're saying, what are the indicators that are forcing people to go one way or another? How are the results being skewed by what we know about it? The first one, obviously, whether they were in Scotland or not, location was massively influential, whether they went to the SNP or not. But the most important thing to us after that was 17%. If a constituency had less than 17% on council housing, they went to the Conservatives. That was true of 263 constituencies. This allowed us to analyze, like I said, what was happening in the election without using polling data, but still be really strong in how we analyze what happened. We were able to produce this 30 minutes after the election results came in. We were the first ones to kind of come out with that. And it was massive for our team to be able to do that. Because as you know, the Times is renowned political columnists, but we were able to do that before even our columnists can do it. A computer and computing had analyzed the election before a human could even make sense of what had just happened to the polls. So this is massively important. This is important, I think. And I mention this because we had teams like us trying to figure out when data is skewed, when data isn't properly being published, when we don't have that accountability, how can we keep going? And I mentioned this, we are of the web and not on the web. This is why I have at the very top. At the moment, I think everyone thinks of data and we think of publishing as putting something out there, and we're chasing technology and we're thinking we just have to keep up with it. Let's just put more information on the web. But I think we need to get to a space when we're of the web. We're using the very fabric of the internet to find open source and to contribute to open source and to use, like I said, in what we do, computing to hold people accountable. I'm just moving through very quickly some of the investigations we've worked on since then. Tax avoidance investigation was one of them, talking about data that comes in horrible formats. A source literally handed us a PDF that was printed onto a sheet of paper with coffee stains all over it, and we had to digitize this, and we ran it through every list that you can imagine, NHS trust members, the legal profession, members, MPs, whatever it was, and we found various people that showed up in that. This, as you can see, is important for accountability. We worked on the FIFA files, which was a massive one, again coming through as you see. Tons of accountability coming after the back of this investigation. What you're seeing, this massive node on the side, is a text analysis about all the emails that had been released to us, and we basically found the relationship between who's in the center, bin Hammam, who was the PA, and his PA who had contacted all of these people, and we were able to kind of chase a lot of this down. But like again, we're in an age where we're still chasing to find information that isn't being public. We've worked on the doping scandal, which came out most recently, in which I had to analyze blood data, something I never thought I would have to do in my life, which that was, again, massively important, and what has led to now, I think it's important that we can say that the UK is holding account on this. We see Russian medals now being questioned in the next Olympics, and this has to do with our analysis on that. This is just to show you the power that when you can look at data properly, who you can hold to account and how we can make changes for that. Which just brings me to my last point, which is after this we published a bunch of data on that, and we held through a bunch of transparency, as I mentioned. But the last two pieces, it's not showing up properly, and there were supposed to be two images. Anyways, I do not love that picture of Camilla, so we're going to just ignore that. But the one on the left-hand side is our GP's award 2 billion deals to their own companies. This was an FOI report. There was another story here that we also talk about agency spending. So we had two stories most recently. This is looking at NHS Trust members and their registered interests and GPs' registered interests. This is all through FOI data. The other piece up here that I was wanted to talk about was our agency spending in councils. This all came from FOI data. This came from our team having to troll through tons and tons and tons of FOI information. And just to give you a sense, I'm sure most of you probably know about FOI in this country, but it's massively important for journalists. It's the sort of bread and butter. But I would argue that even though it is under threat at the moment, there's a much bigger fish to fry. The issue behind FOI, obviously, is that when you're asking a question, you're asking a very narrow scope of a database and what they actually have in that database. And you're not getting the sort of full picture of what's there. Every single department that you're asking it to collects it perhaps differently, and you're having to kind of pull all this information. It takes a lot of work. The government argues it takes them a lot of work, which is probably true, but we're at an age now and we're at a stage where this is being questioned, that we're not going to be opening this data. And I'm arguing essentially that it's massively important to do this. We've been able to basically bring to the public the idea that you have GPs that have registered interests, and this is on your own taxpayer that this is being changed. And we're also looking at it across the board. So I think what we see here is a threat to FOI, the importance of information in that. And what, as you've seen, the things that I've been talking about today are allowing us to look at data in a completely new way, but it's massively challenged. I think it's important what the Whitehall Monitor brought up today, that the digitization of information for government and talking about the opening of data is going to be what I hope completely revolutionizes and changes in the next 5 years. But at the moment, it's been a massive struggle for people on the outside in the journalism industry to look at it. But I think it's going to be increasingly important, as we discussed, for their own accountability and their own measurement. In my experience with my FOI stories and with the stories we've worked on, most of the time when I contact the government about any of these, they don't even know their own figures. Once we've pulled through all this information, we go back to them and say, well, that's not what we had. And there's a very clear understanding that they don't have control of their own data. And that worries me. If you don't even know the totals that we're coming up with, the departmental breakdowns that we're coming up with, how are you measuring it? How are you holding yourselves to account? How are you making decisions about cuts? We know that there's cuts being had, but this is obviously not being based on data. So anyways, it raises important questions. And like I said, I think it's massively important that we're looking at this now. And I look forward to discussing that more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Megan. So now we'll open it up to the audience. Please wait for the microphone to come to you if you'd like to ask a question. Please say your name and your organisation if you have one. Please be brief. And if you're sitting next door and you'd like to ask a question, please come through. We have a spillover room next door. Yes, here.
Government from the Foundation for Science and Technology. Thank you, Gavin, for a very interesting summary of your very long report, which I will take time to read. But one of the issues is presenting absolute information versus presenting relative information. How are you? Is there any capability to benchmark against other countries?
Go ahead.
That's a very good question. We have a very short section at the back on international comparisons. It's not a bit of work that we've looked at in too much depth yet. One of the things that we hope the user survey will show up is whether people are particularly interested in things like that. Obviously, the OECD does some work as well. It's something that we might want to look at more. At the moment, it tends to be quite Whitehall focused, but it'd be very good to talk afterwards about what we might be able to do.
Thank you. I have Richard, then this gentleman here, and then at the back there.
Thanks, Daniel. When I was working in government, Gavin, one of the most egregious examples I came across of government getting it wrong with data was actually courtesy of Francis Maud, the quarterly data summary, which he went to great trouble to require government departments to produce this, and it wasn't used by the departments themselves for any management purposes. You went onto the government's website and it compared it with Oscar data, which is the sort of official way of measuring a lot of these things. And it sort of says, oh, well, you know, the QDS was only there for informational purposes, whatever that means, and that's why it doesn't reconcile with Oscar data. That was the most egregious example I came across. You must come across similar ones, and I was just wondering, you know, from your personal experience, what was the most egregious example of conflicting data from HM government?
Thanks very much. We'll take 3 questions. Can you? Yes, thank you.
Chris Foster, Better Government Initiative. Absolutely fascinating, tremendous stuff. I was very grateful for it. I'd like to ask two questions, but I'll restrict myself to one. If we go back to spending and the size of the fiscal deficit, the National Audit Office has said in several reports that the government makes the mistake of treating the deficit or expenditure of private firms working even 100% of their time for government as being private. Now, that's obviously far from a small mistake. Have you allowed for that in estimating your fiscal deficit?
Thank you very much. And gentleman at the back there.
I'm absolutely fascinated by this. I think it's really interesting, brilliant work. One question that sprung to mind was that all of the data that you've grouped up there, this is true of the whole UK public sector, we do by department and administrative organisation. And I was just wondering whether, in some sense, we've got the division of data wrong, and whether we should be looking at data by programme and by recipient, rather than by the person who's ultimately managing it.
Very good question. Can you let us know your name and where you're from?
I'm Henry Midgley. I'm from the National Audit Office, actually.
Very good. Thank you. I think I'll turn this question back to you, sir. Perhaps, Jeni, perhaps I could ask you to have a go at Richard's question about the egregious examples. You must have come across a few while you were in government. Perhaps you can't
actually,
talk about
no. I think that actually Gavin's much closer to having to handle the data.
Very good.
Sorry.
I've sort of gone data blind over the last few weeks. I might not be able to give the best answer. I think the financial data is a very good example of that. Numbers do not match in different sources. There are some where you've got depreciation, some where you don't. You've got Chancellor's departments, those three letters CXD in some. You've got Treasury versus HMRC in others. It's just the general level of inconsistency across financial data has been quite difficult. Contracting data is another cracking area of difficulty. We've got some of our friends from Spend Network, some of their data is in our report. One of my favourite examples of that was Spend Network found one department appeared to be spending more on one contract than it was spending on out of its entire budget. So they went back to the department and queried this, and it transpired that they hadn't converted the foreign currency back into British pounds. So there are a few examples like that. I mean, to go back to the point Jeni made earlier about canonical registers or canonical lists, that's something that we talk about in the report and we'd be very, very keen on. There should be single sources for these things. You can come across data sets which include arm's length bodies, which don't include arm's length bodies, which are using some accounting systems, using completely different accounting systems. A little bit of consistency would make all of this much more powerful.
And what about this question of division by programme and recipient?
I think that's a really, really good question. It's something that we've talked about in the past as well, because at the moment we tend to, obviously the Institute for Government is interested in government how it currently is, and the data tends to be published in a way that it does make those breakdowns by department. I think we'd be really interested if there were a way of looking at different areas of policy, different spending programmes, and ultimately what it means for the citizen. A lot of people from the Government Digital Service have been talking about getting rid of silos as government becomes more digital over the next few years. Again, I think that sort of plays into those questions as well. That's a very long way of saying we'd be quite interested in doing it. We need to think of a way how, and it would be good to talk afterwards, I think.
Megan?
I would just add on to that. I've had an egregious example with the Department of Health. This is a different example rather than being contradictory, but they accidentally released information. They're not meant to ever release information that could identify anyone, but so if a sample size is smaller than 25 people, they're not supposed to do that. But they accidentally released that openly. I think no one but our team who kind of worked to match all these data sets together could do that. But you find that there's a difficulty in departments who either don't have the data capabilities to do that, or there is many mistakes being made because you could tell it's either not being looked at properly, or there's a manual level of human error to it. And I think once we're talking about this sort of systematic processing of data, and you could just easily read a query that says do not show X number of people. So I think the problem's arising there. And it kind of goes across back to your question as well, that if we actually had data systems in this country, which we don't, systematically categorized, you could slice the data very, very easily by program or by source or whatever it is. But because at the moment everyone is kind of having to generate their own reports, it's actually quite redundant. And I think getting a proper data structure in the back would allow us to slice it either way.
I think one thing that I would add to that is that we need to be basing the ways in which we structure the data based on the needs that we have for making decisions over the top of that data. So that means that you're not just collecting and structuring data based on what's easy or what's the way that we've always done it, but actually going in and looking at what are the needs that we have from this data. As a data user, what are our needs from it? And therefore trying to structure the data and put in the information that satisfies those needs allows us to answer the questions that we want to ask and make the decisions we want to make.
Can I very quickly come back on the private question as well? For the numbers we use for the deficit, we've gone with the Office for Budget Responsibility, but it's a very, very good point, and it's not just finances where that applies. I mean, I've talked a little bit about the difficulties of contracting data per se. There was another quite interesting occasion a few months ago where the latest staff numbers of the civil service were out, and we saw that numbers had actually fallen from about 406,000 to 397,000. Now, a lot of that was because those people who had previously been civil servants were now doing a very similar job, but they've been reclassified to a different sector. That's a very long way of saying it's really complicated, and we try to do what we can to dispel it, but yes, it's tricky.
So we'll have another 3 questions. First, this gentleman here, then Kerry behind you, and then this gentleman here.
Thanks, Peter Campbell from the Business Services Association. I just thinking about the next 5 years and devolution to kind of city regions and cities and Cornwall and other places. Would I be right in saying that it's too early, despite all the pilots that have taken place over the last few years, to say the extent to which that will change the resource management model's graph about how money is spent, the extent to which it is actually genuine, substantial sums that are being going to be spent at a more local level than now? And more generally, to the extent that there is going to be more spending at local level, are there views about the quality of data at local level compared with national level? So if you have infrastructure spending or services spending locally, what do we know about the quality of data that's released locally compared with nationally?
Thank you. At the back, yeah.
Vicky Price from CBR, an ex-government economist. What interests me particularly is the use of data between departments, and that of course requires a lot of cooperation. Finally, researchers can now use some of the data sets from one department, let's say the Home Office, and then connect it with a different department, let's say the Justice, Ministry of Justice, which has been very long in coming. But in fact, that is the thing that should inform policy more than anything else. And at the end of the day, in terms of taking those findings and doing something with them, it is a machinery of government issue. It's whether you cooperate, you look across, and you make your decisions. And that's really what people should be holding government to account. Are they, in fact, making the right decisions based on the right data? And a large part of what doesn't seem to happen, and perhaps you've looked at that in your report, is enough evaluation of policies. Have they, in fact, achieved the right aim? And how exactly do we measure that, both in the short and long term? Not enough evaluations are in fact being done, and now that the data is there, should be more of it around. Then I think that's a sort of push, I guess, that perhaps should be making. And your comments on that would be useful.
Thank you. And this gentleman here.
Thank you very much, Roger South from Leasehold Advisory Service. Clearly, getting more data and transparency is a good thing, and the work is fantastic that's been done. And the more we can encourage openness and data to be put out, the better the research will be and the better the understanding. My worry, with all respect, Megan, is that under Freedom of Information Act, all you want to do is bash people when things are wrong, because all the headlines you've put up have been the problems. If you're going to build trust, if you're going to build transparency, if you're going to build a useful data set, you've got to encourage people to want to make the data open. You've got to encourage people to be responsible and to act in a grown-up way, which means from the newspapers we need to have good news stories rather than bashing people and saying what is good and what has been done, and using the examples of where things may have gone wrong, like the transfer of a currency, which is an easy mistake someone could make, it's just a human error. It doesn't mean they're totally incompetent, it doesn't mean they don't know what they're doing, it doesn't mean they're complete idiots. They're just human beings.
Yeah.
And we need to build trust, and we need to build more responsibility, which doesn't sell newspapers, unfortunately. But I would like a comment of how we're going to get a balance between that, because all people do is go back in their shells.
Thank you very much. Megan, perhaps we can start with that one.
Yeah.
You seem very nice. Are you just bashing people?
No, I completely understand what you're saying, though. There is a definite fear of that. And I notice it, like I said, even from the point of when I work with people, there is that fear mainly because the people I'm talking to they say, I don't even collect the data, I'm just the messenger. And there is that fear of getting it wrong, and there is all of that. And I completely understand what you're saying, that there is quite a negative bit on it. But being that said, we are, though, at a stage where you cannot, without transparency, there is no accountability. I think everyone in this room can agree to that. But we're not even able to compare like with like at the moment. We're not even, because every department is doing something different, there is no measure to compare to people. I mean, it's across the board. I mean, 75% of our foreign aid that's going abroad has withheld recipients. I mean, we're talking, and I'm not going after specific people to kind of bring them down, but we just don't know information. Of course, the first things that you find up are that. But if we did have it across the board, we can talk about areas that are excelling and areas that aren't excelling. I completely understand what you're saying, and I can't promise that if these changes went through, that there wouldn't be negative stories. But I genuinely do believe that the negative stories will fade out, and you will just, in general, have more accountability across the board, and you'll just have better reporting, and not just reporting from journalism, but across the board in government and private sector. I think the charity sector, I think the civil service, everyone would benefit from that, because it's not just about the stories that make the paper, it's about the stories that people are finding in that data to say, we aren't measuring success, or we aren't hitting this or that, and if we have to make cuts, we're making cuts with measured data, we're approaching things in the right way. And I think as long as we open that up, you can see that change. I mean, sure, we talk about a lot of the corruption, which I think sounds negative, but it leads to reform. Yeah, I don't know. That's my point on that. And I was going to make one other note about the local versus national question, which is that you actually find at local levels that the data is quite good. Because people know it a lot better, and they're not held to sort of a larger bureaucracy, and it's amazing, some of it that you see. The flaw in that is also that local election data in this country is held privately. I keep saying this country, sorry. Just in the I come from the U.S. where that just would not stand, and that's something that needs to change as well. So all the local election data, for instance, is collected locally, but it's given to a central place, and then that is all held privately, and that it has to be paid for to access. Things like that need to change for accountability as well.
Thank you. Jeni, do you want to comment on local devolution, local quality, and Vicky's questions about sharing between government departments and evaluation of policies?
Yes.
So in any particular order.
In any particular order. So just on the point around the kind of bashing and the fear of what happens when you open up, I think that there's a distinction that we need to make between being worried about data quality issues and those being shown up, and being worried about what we've done in government and that being found out, right? And if you're worried about what you've done in government and that being found out, then you've probably done something wrong in government and it should be found out. But if you're worried about data quality issues, then I agree that we need to have a mature way of recognising that the data always has errors in it. So one of the things I've written about is the 5 stages of data grief that you go through when you realise that your data is bad, because all data is bad. One of the ways that you get over your data grief is that by opening it up, you get other people to to help you make it better. And that actually helps you to make better decisions because you're relying then on data that is improved. So in the example where you've got the currency wrong, right? If you are actually using that data with that massive figure that was wrong, then you would be making extremely poor decisions, right? You need to know that that data is wrong in order, and external eyes can help you find those problems because it's actually using it. On Vicky's question around use of data between departments, I think one of the things there is we want to get to the stage where we don't have multiple public bodies collecting exactly the same data because they don't trust data that's from another public body. Because when we have multiple public bodies collecting exactly the same data, it's a huge waste. It's really inefficient. How do you get to a place where you can have trust in the data being collected in a good way, being maintained, being made available to you when you don't have management, when you don't have hands-on management of that. That's where I think that these ideas around data infrastructure are really important because they put in place it means thinking through the governance mechanisms, making sure that the community of stakeholders that are using the data are taken into account when any changes are made. It's more than just having it's seeing data as a resource that we can use across government as part of the government as a platform kind of thinking, and not just as single resources that we just keep close by. But I think getting that trust requires us to put in place governance mechanisms, requires there to be consistent funding, requires there to be commitments from departments to make that data available consistently over a long period of time. And then on the devolution point and the quality of data at local level, the one thing that I have seen working for getting consistent data from a range of organisations is by having a single central authority that sets the standards, that actually says this is the data that needs to be published in this format. These are the columns that the CSV has to contain, and actually providing the tools that enable people who are publishing that data to check that their data is valid against that standard. Often, then we get the standard being written about in a nice PDF document that says, and you should publish it in this way. This is what happened with the spending data. You should publish it in this way, and because there's no mechanism for checking whether it has been published in that way, it's actually very difficult for those local authorities or whatever the bodies are to publish according to that standard, and you get a massive mess. So we need the tools, whether those and the automated tools for validation, and also I would say for visualization of that kind of data to enable that consistency. And I think especially in a devolution context where we are going to want to be collecting data from different regions in a consistent way so that we can make comparisons and also so we can learn from each other. I think it's really important that those central bodies are set up and make those standards and provide those tools.
Thank you. Briefly, Gavin.
Very briefly, just to add to all of that. On devolution, it's probably too early, but let's see where we get to for next year's report. I think it's a really interesting question as to what happens with all of that. In last year's report, we actually tried mapping the Barnett consequentials as well for Scotland and Wales, trying to work out the sort of powers that Whitehall departments had over different parts of the UK. Again, if there's more devolution to local areas, it's not just going to be Wales and Scotland where we need to think about that. In terms of sort of sharing data between departments and the evaluation, very much a machinery of government issue. I think just about every report the Institute for Government has ever produced says something like departments need to think about breaking out of silos and working on a more effective cross-government basis. That definitely applies in this area as well. And in terms of evaluation, our impact indicators work showed that, I mean, this is a very difficult thing to do. It can be very difficult to measure impact, but the impact indicators didn't make it easier. There were no baselines, there were no benchmarks. It was really difficult to know what the government was hoping to see and what the connections were between the actions they were taking and the data they were measuring. Hopefully the single departmental plans, which are following at some point after the spending review, might be an opportunity to inject some more evidence into that process. We will see, and we will be tracking them. And finally, on the point about the sort of public conversation around data, which I think is a really interesting area, and I'll just use two vignettes, I think. The first is that last December I went with a couple of Institute colleagues to Maryland in the United States, where they use the STAT form of government, very data-driven, lots of data that's been taken on particular objectives, and then meetings that bring together the governor, in this case Martin O'Malley, who's now running for president, with the relevant agency heads. They go through the key charts, and they try to discuss what comes next. Now, he realised when he first started doing that, it was a huge political risk for exactly the reasons that you've outlined. His view was that actually he needed the political courage to do it, because if he didn't embrace his political goals, nobody else was going to. And it was striking that when a particular chart, which was showing a use of a particular drug actually going up in Maryland, the conversation wasn't about blame, it was very much about, okay, what is this telling us? How can we do that? That obviously takes some time to develop. But the second vignette that I'd use is a UK one, and it's the Major Projects Authority. Now, we have some of the data in this year's annual report. Major Projects Authority was set up under the Coalition, and it provides assurance and also RAG ratings, red, amber, green, about project delivery confidence. Before the first annual report, I think a lot of people were quite nervous that you might suddenly end up with projects being red rated. And obviously, a lot of the stories were around the red rated projects when it came out. Second year, the stories were not about the red-rated projects. They were about a reset project, Universal Credit, which I think a lot of people had felt was trying to avoid that particular system. So it's interesting to see how that's evolving. And I think the third year of the report, again, quite intelligent reporting around it. It takes time. It's about a much wider public conversation and attitudes towards data. And also, I think the different periodicity, to use a horrible communications word, about freedom of information, which is quite reactive, versus open data, which is potentially more regular. So I think we're very much at the start of seeing what all of that means for government.
Thank you. And just come back on the devolution point to use the chair's privilege. I mean, I think I would say pay a lot less attention to the figures in press releases that say there's going to be 30 million for this infrastructure or whatever. 30 million doesn't get you a lot of infrastructure. But pay a lot more attention to the transfer of business rates, which will be 100% by 2020. That's going to have a really big impact on the way local government works and the distribution of resources around the country. And we don't know what the redistribution mechanism is going to be, but it's a big story of the next 5 years, I think. Two final questions, briefly, please. The gentleman at the back, and then Nigel here, and then we're going to have to close.
Ian McGill from Spend Network. We spend a lot of time processing lots and lots of data from lots and lots of different people. And one of the problems that we've noticed is that the data is getting worse. And in particular, for example, there's one central department that hasn't published any spending data for over a year. We feel that the answer to this is to get government to actually use the data it publishes. How would the panel encourage government to do that?
Thank you. Good question. Nigel?
Nigel Campbell, Implementation Unit. I work at the Cabinet Office and should therefore duck. I was very interested, the coalition in charts. I thought, right, I'm going to find out how we did. And we saw a lot about spend and a lot about workforce, which are basically the inputs. I'd be really interested in your views on the outcomes and the impact. There's a lot of data out there on health and employment and housing and lots of other subjects. And I'd be really interested in that thought. I mean, using data to make decisions absolutely is all over what we're doing. And Jeni, you said about transparency and accountability, it's really hard to pick the KPIs. Actually, there are 517 manifesto commitments. And as we've got a single party government, that's a set of things to hold the government to account for. By the way, 517 might change because you can debate whether or not recruiting maths and physics teachers is one, not two, but there's clearly over 500. And the single departmental plans should include all of those and anything else that the government thinks is absolutely central to what it's doing.
Thank you very much. Well, we're almost at 10 o'clock, so I'll ask the panel to respond very briefly to those questions and make any final remarks, all in a minute each.
Gavin. Thanks, Daniel. In terms of getting government to use it, again, I would throw that out to the audience as well. Do tell us how you think we can play a role in that. Obviously, sorry, try not to hit my microphone. We've noticed a few departments have started to use bits and pieces, not the spend so much, but I think Jeni mentioned earlier the grade charts about how their organisations are made. I think the more that we keep using their data and trying to get government to do it itself, show the value of actually using the data, which we can do a bit of. I think that's really important. But again, suggestions very welcome, something we're going to be thinking about over the next year or so. In terms of outcomes, if you look at the annual report, you will see it's quite input heavy, and there's a lot more data that's easily gettable and available from government on that. Ditto on outputs. On outcomes, we've tried to do a bit using the impact indicators. As I said, we didn't find that they were a particularly useful way for doing it, and we very much look forward to the single departmental plans, which will hopefully be emerging soon. But there's a bit more in the report. It is a very difficult area to measure properly, and again, we'll look what happens when we get the SDPs.
So how should we encourage government to use spend data in order to improve its publication? I really don't know. Show what's possible. I think that's the only, and keep telling them to. That's all. That's all I can answer on that. On the kind of on the KPIs, yeah, completely agree. You know, it's politicians' job to set our priorities, and that's what they lay out in their manifesto. What we need to have is the direct link between each one of those commitments and the measurable metric, right? So, which is the statistic that is used to measure success or failure against this particular manifesto commitment? And if that data isn't currently being collected, well, it's the job of the Office of National Statistics to be going out and getting statistics for government, so to measure those things. So I think that having that mapping, having that very clear mapping, is the thing that we need to do.
Final word, Megan.
I would just say, I think both questions are completely related. I think if we actually held the indicators as measures of success, you could measure output and outcome in the same way. I think, but the problem is we're not doing that. And I mentioned that sort of earlier, that we're allowed to be dictated to at this point. But I think every citizen in this country, and I think every organization can do that. I work in innovation and journalism, but I really do think that with data and the open of data, people can actually hold government to account with that. And not necessarily in a negative way, but you sort of say, this is an indicator that the government has done, why haven't you hit it? Or if you have hit it, celebrating whatever that is. But we have the power now with the information. We've got charities, NGOs, public bodies all over the place that can actually that's the best thing about data, is you bring it right to their face and you say, here it is, what are you going to do about it? And we have people now and means to crowdsource and crowdfund to actually put that pressure there. We don't have to sit and allow politicians to dictate it to us anymore. That's the beauty of technology at the moment. So I'm really interested to see how that would work. Use indicators to do that, to hold people accountable and gather people together to sort of put it back to the government.
Thank you very much. So there are some old-fashioned hard copies of this report outside. For those of you who don't want to carry the report or don't manage to get hold of one, they will doubtless go like hotcakes. You will receive an email with a copy of the report, and also, as Gavin mentioned earlier, there will be a survey attached to that. Please do fill it in. This report takes a lot of resources. Gavin has a whole set of galley slaves down in the basement of the Institute, who some of whom are here today. We let them out briefly to come and have some breakfast. But please do join me in thanking the panel, Gavin, Jeni and Megan.